Cool, well, we'll get started. Welcome back, hope you enjoyed your lunch. I'm Dustin Phillips, the Executive Director of the Greater Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society and co-chair of the Internet Governance Forum USA. This morning, we heard a lot of different perspectives on some of the implications of data collection from a bunch of different angles, and we also discussed a variety of frameworks to potentially deal with that. This group will continue to discuss the prospects for achieving data privacy in the US in the context of the current push for federal legislation. But instead of focusing specifically on a broad framework and figuring out things like enforcement mechanisms or preemption or opt-in versus opt-out, we're going to focus in directly on some of the problems that we're going to try to solve and then discuss what solutions can potentially be put into place, and then turn the discussion to if and how legislation can provide the framework that we need for implementing solutions to these problems. We have a variety of expertise and experience on the panel that will make for a very enlightening discussion that will hopefully contribute to a state of meaningful data privacy that balances the needs of users and businesses and operates within technical realities of the internet and respects our individual and collective rights. That should be pretty easy, right? So I'll provide a brief introduction for each panelist and go down the line, and then I will let them speak a little bit more about their work. So I will start closest to me with Arlo Gilbert. He's a serial entrepreneur that has built companies and industries including search, telecom, marketing, health IT, and enterprise software. His latest venture is a company called Osano, which is seeking to increase data transparency and also provides the privacy monitor, which we will hear more about in a minute. I want to thank Arlo for making this trip because I first learned about his project on Friday and sent him a message on Twitter and asked if he could make it with a kind of long shot request, and here he is. Next to him, we have Olmstead, who's an internet security and privacy analyst for the Internet Society, and he helps research, analyze, write, and review technical content relating to the work of the Online Trust Alliance. And previously, he spent 12 years at the Pew Research Center studying how the internet affects American life. Next to him, we have Alan Butler, who's senior counsel at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. He manages EPIC's litigation, including the Amicus program, and files briefs in emerging privacy and civil liberties cases before the US Supreme Court and other appellate courts. Next to him, we have Katie McAuliffe, who is the Executive Director of Digital Liberty and the Federal Affairs Manager for Americans for Tax Reform. Her research and advocacy focus on a variety of telecom and technology issues, including various aspects of the privacy discussion. And at the end, we have Amie Stepanovich, US Policy Manager and Global Policy Counsel at Access Now, where she focuses on domestic surveillance, cybersecurity, and almost exclusively now privacy law, right? A few weeks ago, they had their data privacy summit, so I hope we can hear a little bit about that. But yeah, why don't we just start with Arlo. Tell us a little bit about what you're bringing to the table, and then we'll work our way down.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. So my name is Arlo Gilbert. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Osano. We are focused on building data privacy tools for consumers and businesses. And the first tool we launched is called Privacy Monitor. We created an ontology for privacy practices, and then we have about 24 attorneys who help us to rate the privacy practices of various companies. We turn those into easy-to-understand scores for consumers in hopes that that will be one of the first steps that we can take to educate people about their rights and whether they should trust companies. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dustin, for having me here. This is a really fun event. So I'm from the Internet Society, and I work on a online trust audit. We are in our 10th year, and actually the timing of today is great for us, not great for you guys. It's coming out tomorrow morning, so I can't share all the data because this is being live streamed. But what my piece of the puzzle was, I read around 1,200 privacy policies and scored them across about 30 variables. That's what I can bring to the table here. I will say in my personal life, and I don't know exactly what this says about notice of consent, but I certainly don't read privacy policies when I'm signing up for anything, ever. And so from our perspective, what we try and do is help companies really tell consumers what they're doing with their data, with empirically measured privacy policies.
As was mentioned, thanks for having me here. I am at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC, a nonprofit that focuses public attention on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. We've obviously been working on this in this area for many decades and work on the whole range of issues with respect to consumer data, but also government surveillance, open government, other issues. I think on the particular issue that we're discussing on the panel today, especially thinking about how the system in the United States can be made to work from a data protection perspective. I mean, ultimately, our view is that there needs to be federal baseline legislation, that this needs to be, there need to be rights and responsibilities based in law and regulation, and the consumers themselves are not going to be able by themselves to fix this problem. It is at the end of the day, a law problem, and there needs to be law to fix it. But I think we're increasingly trying to just review what's happening on the ground for consumers, watching out cases you mentioned. We do a lot of litigation work, including filing in cases all across the country that involve emerging issues, and we're really trying to figure out how the current laws are being applied, but also looking forward to a more updated and comprehensive regime.
Hey, so Katie McAuliffe, I am head of Digital Liberty, which is a sister organization of Americans for Tax Reform. So you might not think of Americans for Tax Reform as paying attention to technology issues, but that is what I do exclusively. I look at tech and telecom issues and have been very involved in a lot of the process for a long time, and particularly on privacy. In this space, there are lots of different aspects of privacy. So there's sensitive and non-sensitive, and I think there might be somewhere in between a different type of data that we aren't really looking at, and that might be where we have some kind of issue or something that needs to be addressed. And in that context, I look at things from the consumer data perspective. So I'm not looking at the government uses or what might throw you in jail or might not throw you in jail, but how is my data being treated, and am I being fairly compensated for that data? So in my view, I look at privacy as more of a currency rather than a right.
My name is Amie Stepanovich. I don't do microphones well, so I'm going to apologize in advance. Access Now has been in the data privacy / data protection, which I will say at some point because I'm going to slip into that debate since we became an organization 10 years ago, primarily in the context of the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, the GDPR, which is an acronym I hope you all are familiar with if you're in this room or watching on the live stream. Hello. We have an office in Brussels. We actually have 13 offices all around the world. We have an office in Brussels that worked very closely on the GDPR and its passage and being entered into force. And that work now feeds a lot of our global work on data privacy and all of the different areas that we work in, including the United States. We look to the passage and the implementation of the GDPR as a lesson that we can all learn from. And so in that regard, we like to think of it as something that we can study and figure out what worked, what would work here in the United States, what we can do better, and what we should just bring over. A couple of the lessons that I think are most important. One is that tech's expanding. Where tech does not already touch your daily life, it's going to very soon with the expansion of artificial intelligence, the growing use of algorithms, smart cities that incorporate the Internet of Things, which are already everywhere. I imagine most of you have one sitting in your homes, if you don't count the phone that you carry on you as an Internet of Things device. Another lesson is that this is not a privacy conversation. We use a lot of acronyms and terms of art and phrases that are very specific to privacy, but this cuts across so many different issues. And I think that's one of the things from the Data Privacy Summit that I'd like to bring in. We talked about misinformation, cybersecurity, domestic abuse, civil rights. These are all separate policy areas, but they all are going to be impacted by whatever comes out of these privacy conversations we're having now and whatever law that hopefully ends up getting passed at the federal level. And so we have to look at this as a broader conversation and pull in those points of view and be receptive to having conversations with people who don't have our same vocabulary And I think that's going to be increasingly important, being welcoming to people who don't understand what a FIP is and why there's sometimes one P and why there's two Ps and what that means. Talking in a way that people understand, I think, is a great lesson for us all.
Awesome, thank you. Just a brief pause. Do we have audio? No, we do not have audio? Okay, well, it's off the record, so you can give us all of the secrets. Except for all the tweeting. Right. So basically, I want to kind of start the dialogue off with a discussion about this relationship between the consumers, namely their data, and those that collect, store, and use this data in a variety of ways for a variety of purposes. We discussed this morning a lot of the broader societal impacts of mass data collection, but as we kind of look into solutions, I at least want to start off with this point of interaction, which is the terms of service and the privacy policies that we're consenting to without reading. And this concept of these consumers and users being left in the dark and having this state of information asymmetry where how our data is being collected, how it's being used, who's using it, we're not really aware of, but we tend to agree to it because, well, even if we did read these things, there's probably a lot of legal, technical, and obscure details that prevent us from really understanding it. And in a recent survey by IBM's Institute for Business Value, they found that 81% of consumers say that in the past year they've become more concerned about privacy, and also that 89% said that companies should be clearer about how their products use data. Arlo and Kenny, I know that both of you are kind of focused on analyzing these privacy policies in different ways. So I wonder if you two could kind of talk about why it's so difficult to understand what's being done with our data, and is it just a problem with the privacy policies, or is there something more to it?
Well, it's nice to meet you. It sounds like we're very interested in the same topic. So, I think that you have a variety of reasons why these legal documents are so long and hard to read. One of them is the companies have lawyers, and they have to earn their keep. They want to protect their clients, as they should, and so they're going to put a lot of stuff in there that the average consumer doesn't understand or necessarily consent to. When we go and read these policies, we see the vast majority of companies out there are good actors that are trying to do the right thing while also protecting their interests. We do find companies who hide things on a pretty regular basis. We created a thing last month called the Misleader Board and started calling out some of these companies. And the things that they hide are pretty malicious. They're intentional.
My favorite was Delta's.
Yeah, Delta Airlines wrote a 9-page privacy policy, and the last line says this is not a legal document. So you see things like this on a regular basis, and we think that the biggest problem that exists is what you said, which is this information asymmetry, which is that the average person is not equipped with the tools to understand what these documents say. They don't have the time to read them. And if they did, again, are they in a place to decide whether or not to use this tool that they may want to use anyways?
Thank you, and I agree we are in a very same space. From our perspective, the reason we score privacy policies is essentially we want to help companies communicate with their users what they're doing with their data. And we score it on about 30 variables that range from very simple things like, is there a date stamp at the top? And we found that about half of the companies didn't even have that. And that's a huge problem. And then they range to even more complicated things like, do they have language about, do we share with third parties? Do they say who those third parties are? Do they share with affiliates? Stuff like that. And what we found is, I agree, most companies are good actors. Their privacy policies are generally good. However, there are very basic things a lot of companies don't do that could really help consumers understand what they're doing with their data. As I mentioned, the date stamp is a big one. Archives, we think archives are really important so you can see what changes over time in the privacy policy. And then sort of other, that we found that about 20% of companies, only 20% of companies, have language saying that they don't share with affiliates, meaning 80% of companies had some sort of paragraph saying, we don't sell or rent your data, but we will share it with affiliates or third parties, and they don't say what those are. That's a problem, right? From a user perspective, your expectation is, if you're gonna share my data with a third party, you should at least tell me what the category is, right? That's what GDPR says. And then finally, the other thing I would say is, in a sort of bigger picture sense, what we saw is privacy policies and the way they're structured varies dramatically across companies. Some companies have 9-page policies that are structured. Some companies have 9-page policies that have a really good summary at the top. Some of them have 3-sentence policies. That's a problem. If you're a user, you should expect the privacy policy to look sort of vaguely the same and have at least the same kind of information in it. And I think that's something that we advocate at the Internet Society.
Just one thing to add, the question was brought up of why are privacy policies like this? I think one of the reasons is because the way the US has always regulated privacy is through the Federal Trade Commission's unfair and deceptive trade practices jurisdiction, which means companies have always been incentivized to write something that allows them to do whatever they want to do without lying. And so a lot of these really broad, non-specific privacy policies that you can get are built that way because of the way that we have approached privacy as a country, and the legal regime that could subject companies, maybe one day eventually, Alan can talk about this more, to some sort of financial penalties. And the whole structure has been avoiding that. Don't lie. And if you don't lie, everything is going to be okay. And then one other word about why do people not read these? I think I have not read as many as you, but I've probably read more privacy policies than most people. And you read them and it's like you say, like, we'll share some data with some people sometimes, and you have to let us do this if you want to use this service. And I have no choice. Like, I can't say no if I want to use the service. I can't say, well, maybe only some of this stuff, but some of this stuff is not acceptable. It's either yes or no. So why there is no incentive for people to read these privacy policies because they're not empowered to do anything at all, even with notwithstanding the fact that they're unapproachable legalese and not able to be interpreted.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there one point on that too. I think another reason is that in the US, another way we structure privacy is around silos. We do it by industry. So, at least at the moment, the financial industry has one set, HIPAA's another set, there are others. One really weird thing that we noticed was there are about 100 banks in our sample, give or take. And most of them were using a form that was created by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in like 2000. It's this very specific structured form where it's like a table and it has a list of data things. And they're the only industry that does this. And so that's weird, right? It's strange that they have this very specific structure to their policies, but other industries don't. And that's can be very confusing for consumers because of the structure here in the banks is that's actually do say, we share your data in this circumstance for this reason, period. Why don't all companies do that? I think that's a question that we've had looking at all these.
I think that's a really good point because when we're looking at technology and how that pervades pretty much everything that we do, especially when we're getting into machine-to-machine communication, the privacy policy and what we have needs to be consistent across industries. It needs to be consistent across the country. Like, we can't have all of this divided up. So when we're looking at these, it's kind of looking at what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I think I would say that FTC isn't so much about don't lie, it's about what causes harm. And I think we've really focused on that in that the most harm could be done in the financial and the health industries. But as we're moving forward and those silos aren't as clearly defined, harm is, if you're working with a company that collects genetics, well, they're not necessarily covered by HIPAA, but you would expect them to have higher privacy protections than they do. And they don't, and they aren't subject to some of those penalties or anything along those lines. Same with financial institutions, and then some of these, what are they like, the quick loan companies? Yeah, well, not all of fintech, but and I'm not calling out any of this as particularly bad, but we're at a point where things have changed so much that we need to readdress this. And I think one of the things to look at is like, where is that harm and what is the harm? And if I'm going back and I'm looking at what is the harm to me, I'm thinking about where am I being compensated and how is the data being used, right? I don't particularly care for sharing with third parties. Because if I'm having a conversation with you, right, I'm telling you all of these things and I've given you that information, You can go and do whatever you want with that information, unless maybe we've said, hey, this is between us, cone of silence. That would be really nice. Or you said, yeah, we're going to have this conversation and you can share what information you want, but I'm not going to attribute it to you. Or everything is free and you can know it. So if I'm talking with a company, I'm giving them information and they're using that information to improve their product. They're also using that information to kind of, I hate using the word subsidize, but subsidize some of the freeness of whatever it is. That's okay. But when I am not aware that I'm having a conversation with you anymore is when I start to have a problem, when I'm not compensated for not being aware that we're having a conversation. So I get worried when my machines are talking to each other and I'm not aware that they're necessarily talking to each other all the time and I'm not being compensated for that exchange of data. So that's where I think harm will happen in the future if we don't work on this. And talk to a lot of people with different views, look at a lot of different options if we don't work on this now, because 10 years down the road, there's going to be a lot of information that we can't get back.
I think that there's a couple, picking up on a couple of the themes that we've been discussing and bring it back around to this question of, how do we get to where we need to be? I think that the sort of transparency, openness conversation around privacy policies and disclosures and what consumers understand about what companies that they interface with are doing is valuable, but it is not enough. We have to get away from the original sin of notice and choice in the United States as a model for regulating anything, except that transparency and openness are part of a workable data protection system. Obviously, as a baseline, if you're a consumer, you need to be able to know meaningfully and comprehensively what the companies that you interface with are doing. But there's a second layer to this, which is that much of the data collection that happens day in, day out nowadays is not the companies that you are interfacing directly with, especially on the internet, right? When you are interfacing with a company on the internet by going to their website or reading an article or a post, your data is not just being collected by the company that you're going to, it's being collected by a whole bunch of other companies up and down the stack and maybe sort of exiting out the apps or other items that you're using to connect to that particular company and going elsewhere, and you have no awareness of where that is. I mean, a privacy policy is never really going to tell you where all that data is going and what are the business practices of those companies that are collecting your data. So it's really beyond a face-to-face, one-to-one transaction. We're not really talking about transactional relationships or contracts meaningfully. That's why, in order to have consistency in terms of the handling of your data, there need to be baseline rules that cut across all industries. We have to get away from the silos. And I also think increasingly the lines between different types of data and whether this type is more sensitive than that type break down as the types and quantities of data expand. So I think that we need to get away from the old model, which was notice and choice in silos, and we need to kind of throw that whole thing out and accept transparency as part of a system of actual rules based in law and regulation that are cut across the board, not in silos.
Yeah, I can speak to that real quickly too. The other thing we measure for the report has two sections. We do site security and privacy. The statement's part of it. The other one is we look at web beacons. And we found that across these companies, it ranges from some don't have no web beacons at all, and some have up to 40. And if you read the privacy statement, and unless you're sort of a nerd like we are, you have no way of knowing that, right? If you're on whatever site, you don't know that there's a Google tracker, there's a whatever. That's a problem. I think that is, we think that you have to, at the very least, disclose that. And on top of that, really think about how many trackers you even have on your site. 40 trackers on a website where a consumer is not aware of that is a lot.
I'd love to chime in here real quickly as well. Great points. So I like to think about tuna fish. And the reason I like to think about tuna fish is because when I go to Whole Foods and I buy a can of tuna, I don't have to read an 18-page document to find out what's inside of it. When we talk about beacons and we talk about notice of consent, I don't actually see these as separate issues, because when I go to a website that has 40 beacons on it, those 40 beacons are ingredients on that website. Okay, and the company that is making that cookie or that can of tuna or that web page, they're at the end of the day the one that's responsible for that. We do see these things as very closely connected, and that you can't separate. A modern technology company is built on top of other technology companies. Long gone are the days where everybody has a data center and they keep everything in their own system. Everybody uses an outsourced financial system like NetSuite. They're using outsourced tax systems. They're using outsourced customer management systems and customer relationship management systems and all sorts of different tools that are built underneath the tools that you're interfacing with. And so, our view about notice of consent and about what's necessary and needed is really just a simple, clear disclosure that the average sixth grader can understand. Right? We don't need more 18-page documents. What we need is really clear disclosures. We already do it on cars. We do it on food. It's effective. It's useful, and there are penalties for not complying with these things. So I don't quite understand why we don't just do that when it comes to data privacy.
I would say we should probably do both. But let's give the easy to understand things to the people who aren't going to spend a lot of time, and the 18 pages to the lawyers who can dig in and use the information. Alan talked about getting rid of old ways of approaching this. One thing that I would really love to throw out the door, personally, conversation point that I would love to never hear again, is this idea of consumer privacy. Honestly, it's not about consumers, it's about people. It's about all of the individuals who are having their data collected, regardless of if they're buying anything or interacting with a business across the internet, and increasingly just in the real world, having this data collected. And Katie's talked a few times about compensation. I would also like to not see privacy become a privileged good that is available to those who can pay for it and preys upon those who cannot pay for it, marginalized populations, communities that are going to be more likely to be preyed upon and coerced into giving up pieces of privacy. Is the stream back yet? No. So confession.
You guys have a good dialogue going. Keep it going.
I'm a big fan of The Walking Dead. Really corny TV show that nobody watches anymore because it's been on for 10 seasons and doesn't make sense. And I was binging to catch up on it the other day. And when you binge on TV shows, you get the same commercials over and over and over again, so you really have to dig into those commercials. It was for an insurance company who wanted to track all of your driving data, and if you were a good driver, they were going to give you a great big discount. And that was that's notice and consent. You are choosing to give over certain amounts of data, you're consenting for it, and in return, you get this discount. But there's this entire back end that they don't tell you about. They're not wanting that data just to give you a discount. They're wanting that data so they can build massive amounts of databases about people who drive well and don't drive well. So in the future, they can make determinations without even getting that data. You're buying into the system that's a huge societal harm. And you're doing it because you can't afford necessarily that $200 a month insurance policy that you need so you can get to work every single day. And these are the conversations I think we have to have much more in depth. Thanks. And on that note.
Well, so then I'll go back to the point of I look at compensation very differently. I want everyone to get paid for their work. I want everyone to be compensated for what it is that they do. I want to be compensated. I want my stuff protected. I want your stuff protected. I want those kind of things. If you don't like discounts, don't take them. If you do like discounts, take them. I tend to say no, but sometimes I say yes. And I think that's where the point of transparency is really helpful, because that gives me the information to decide whether that discount is worth it or not. And I will use my very embarrassing story, which I have told you, where I have given over a significant amount of my data because I think Bitmoji is super cool. And Bitmoji says, the pop-up right there says, we will have access to everything you have ever typed on your keyboard and everything you will ever type on your keyboard. I don't know why they need that. That's awful. I said no, and I kept saying no, and I kept saying no, and everybody keeps sending these funny pictures, and I wanted to send funny pictures too. So I said yes. And I know that. And there's a big part of me as being someone who cares about this kind of stuff that's really mad at myself, but a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I don't like to text. So I've given up this kind of, now this is a very small example in terms of how much your insurance costs or how much it doesn't cost. But if that's an option to people, why shouldn't they have it? Why shouldn't I be able to get a lower, why shouldn't I be able to get a discount? I get a discount at CVS because they know what I bought, and they're like, hey, we want you to buy this instead, here's a discount for it. Why are discounts wrong? Why couldn't we be directly paid? I don't see why not. So those are the things that I want to think about. I don't look at compensation as a way of command and control, but I look at compensation as of give me what is rightfully mine. If you're going to follow me on every website and you're going to put a beacon on every single website and know everything that I'm doing, and I have a choice, you're going to let me know that that's happening, then maybe I can say yes and I'm okay with that. Maybe I can say no and I'm not okay with that. So those options, I mean, you can look at Android versus Apple operating systems. If you bought an Android phone, it was significantly cheaper than your iPhone. There's a reason for that. We know that. I wouldn't mind if more people knew about that, but I wouldn't want anyone to be deprived of that discount or that choice, ever.
Just want to, actually, the Bitmoji example is really interesting. I have a 15-year-old niece, so this is not a negotiable in my world, having Bitmoji on my phone. Like, it's just not a thing that I cannot communicate with. True story. You can have it on your phone and use it without having it as a keyboard and totally participate in that environment. But they're not upfront with you about these other options that you don't have to give up your data for, which is kind of going back to this like weirdly coercive, like, make it really easy and give us all of your information. They also say in their privacy policy, we can collect all of this information and share it with third parties, but they tell you in a different area, we'll have access to this, but we won't use it. And it's this weird double thing where it's like, well, it's not in your privacy policy that you won't use it, but you tell me this at some other place, and I'm really confused, actually, by what you're doing with this. I'm a pretty sophisticated consumer, and I have no idea what they're having access to.
And I had done that, too. I had it separate so that they couldn't get any of my information, and it got too difficult. Like, I'm just going to admit it got too difficult. There's this whole theory of, like, fast, cheap, and easy. And you can get something fast and cheap, but it won't be easy. You can get something easy and cheap, but it won't be fast. And I kind of look at a lot of the stuff that way, like where am I giving and where's my give and where's my take on this? And unfortunately, Bitmoji won.
And I think the Bitmoji, if you use it without the keyboard, you don't have the search function, so you have to manually scroll through. At least I haven't figured out how to search on there yet. You can show me later.
I feel like also part of building off of this, very specific example we're talking about, I think part of the issue with the conversation that happens from kind of coming at this problem from multiple angles is that, like, some people view the systems that are in place right now, the technologies, the business models, the business practices, as sort of, we take them for granted and then we say, okay, how do we marginally sort of improve this experience for users or maybe this experience for businesses, depending which side you're on. But the more fundamental question, I think, is what are the rules at play in this system, right? What are the underlying things that you are just prohibited from doing, right, that you're permitted to do? And I think that there are definitely categories of business practices and data collection that should be outright prohibited. I think just because, if for example, Apple decided tomorrow that they just want to, turn on a secret remote activation feature for all microphones and all Apple devices, and they'll just turn that on, and they can figure out the business model later, but that's a feature that they want to have. That's illegal. That's a bug. They're not allowed to do that in the United States, so they can't do that. It's not about notice and choice. It's not about, what box do we have to check, right? What disclosure do we have to provide on a website? They're not allowed to do that. And I think there are a number of categories, especially with emerging technologies and business practices, where we're going to need to grapple with. Are there just things that people should not be allowed to do? And I think the answer is definitely yes, just a question of what's in that set.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to the kind of gaps in and the vulnerabilities that are left after we kind of figure out how we can bridge this information asymmetry. But there, there's the well-documented privacy paradox. And in a PricewaterhouseCoopers survey in 2017, they found that 27 or 25% of people believe that most companies handle consumer data responsibly, and only 15% of them think that companies actually make their lives better. Those 15%, they obviously haven't used Bitmoji, but I do want to go back to what we were discussing about how to do better, how to do better with this become better than notice and consent, right? So how do we make it apparent that there are 40 trackers beyond just maybe Shane can hear us now, but she likes to say that the cookie click-throughs are the mattress tags of the internet. And she's right, nobody really cares about that. Nobody reads it. They just click through it to get to what they want to use. So what steps can we take to be better, both on the business side of things and being not just transparent, because transparency doesn't mean anything if you ship a room full of documents to somebody and expect them to find what they're looking for, right? So how do we get better about that? And does that kind of deal with this privacy paradox in any meaningful way? And then after we kind of discuss to what extent that helps, then we can look at where these gaps are and what we need as a baseline.
I will just happily say tuna fish again. I think that is the solution to many of these problems is very clear notice. I mean, when we look at how GDPR was written, they define transparency when they're talking about making sure people have the ability to consent or that they can get access to things. But what they don't do is define what transparency is. Right? They just leave that up to everybody to kind of play around with, and we'll figure it out in the courts. And that's a terrible way to do things. So I think that we're all, many of us are on the same page that there's some sort of legislation coming at a federal level that will have to address some of these shortcomings. And what I'm hopeful is that legislation will not purely be about enforcement and industry-focused regulation so that they can make the documents longer, but really have a carve-out about what's required for consumers and non-consumers to be able to clearly understand what they're getting into. Yeah, I don't mean to beat that drum, but it's something I'm very passionate about.
I was going to ironically come in back on the tuna fish example as well, but from a very different direction. So I think that the reason that I'm confident that I can go to the store and buy a can of tuna fish and eat it and will not die of a horrendous illness is because we actually have a very deep and detailed infrastructure of safety compliance around food, and it actually goes all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century when we had in a bad way, a kind of industrial food revolution that caused a lot of real illness and sickness. And the reaction to that was actually the emergence of product liability and a whole bunch of regulatory regimes at the state and federal level dealing with consumer product safety. And I think we need to have that we are in the middle of having that revolution when it comes to data collection. And it doesn't, the notice, again, the openness, the transparency is important, and I totally agree. I think that individuals need to be able to know what they're buying, but that there has to be something backing that up. Otherwise, you're not left with anything.
I do, and Dustin, you kind of asked a two-part question. Because you how and then what is in it. And I think legislation is where we're going. There's no world I can imagine, and I wouldn't have said this before January, but there's no world I imagine where in the next 4 years we don't see a really comprehensive privacy law in the US. The reason that it might take that long is because I don't think people who want a comprehensive law are going to accept anything that's not incredibly strong and protective, and companies seem to still be pushing for notice and consent in some way. And in the meantime, what's going to happen is we're going to have California, we're going to have Washington, we're going to have Illinois and New York, and all of these other states are going to pop up with laws. And so the industry case for a federal privacy law is going to get larger as time goes on, whereas I'm still not going to be happy unless we're actually protecting privacy in a law. We have a really pretty one-pager because everything in DC should fit on one page. I hate being that person who's like, here's my one sheet of paper about what we think should be in a privacy law. And one of the things I think is really important is making sure you can preserve innovation. States need to be able to still see where there are emerging privacy issues and act on those issues. And we're looking at, I still remember the days of GeoCities and Hotmail and Ask Jeeves. I just watched Captain Marvel yesterday, and revisiting the 90s internet was a lovely experience. When we didn't have advertising as the de facto business model of all all web companies. And that was really interesting. And it's like at some point we just decided that advertising was going to be the way people were going to make money, and that required massive amounts of data collection. One of the things we're looking for is like, why aren't we investing in alternatives, like companies that are being innovative about how to make money and how to do things, and looking at ways to get past this rut we've been stuck in on like advertising has to be the thing that we go to.
I would agree with a lot of things that we've been said. I mean, there's some things that just shouldn't happen. Like, I don't like the idea that privacy policies can change without me knowing about it, and I'm still consented to it. You know, I don't really like that idea. But there are a lot of other things that we can do that still allow movement and allow an advertising model to still continue while we have other models at the same time. And I would agree, you know, like when we go back to the food revolution, right? We were trying a bunch of different things. Trying a whole bunch of different things, and some of those things didn't work. Like cholera is pretty nasty. That was more the water revolution, though. We talk about like getting clean water, you know, like it's kind of gross to have a butcher's shop like right next to a nursery. That's, you know. But so like we look at those kind of things and we move forward and we decide what it is and what it is we probably shouldn't be doing. And we've gotten to a place where a lot of us are feeling some kind of discomfort with whatever is going on the internet. And we're looking at that, and I think we need to be really careful that we just don't go based off of an emotional feeling on this particular thing and think about what it is that we really need to protect. I look at what kind of data collection is going to cause me harm. And when I look at harm and what could actually, like a bad thing that could actually happen to me from data collection, it's like, how much of a relationship does this company have with law enforcement? Are they giving away information that they shouldn't be sharing with law enforcement? Or how well are they protecting the data that they've collected? I don't really feel like we can have a conversation about data collection, data privacy, if we aren't also talking about security. If the data is not protected, well, I mean, some of it's sensitive, some of it's non-sensitive, some of it's something else. Non-sensitive, right? It's like anything that you might put on a Facebook profile if you still use Facebook. You know, hi, so my name is Katie. I have a dog. I'm a Catholic. Like, these are the things about me that people know. Not a big deal if that gets out there. It gets a little bit more sensitive
I do think
if
that
it's
religion could be sensitive depending on what your religion
yeah,
is.
you're right. But I decided to put it on my Facebook page. Sorry. So because I put it on there, like, right? If you didn't put it on there, then yes, it could definitely be sensitive. So maybe let's move on to like, I like soccer. That's a little bit easier. Okay. So then you're going through these things that like I've decided to put out there, but then there are the things that maybe I didn't decide to put out there. I decided to share it with just one company, and I know that they have it. They're going to share it with third parties. Maybe it's anonymized, maybe it's not, but I've done that. I'm beginning to fall into the do not track camp, which I was very much against about 10 years ago. And I think revisiting and looking at some of that will give us some different options for where compensation can or cannot occur, and what kind of regime that could look like. I think solely focusing on notice and consent is probably not the way to go, because I think we're asking for notice and consent about the wrong things.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said. One of your earlier points, I can sort of one of my favorite paragraphs that pops up in tons of privacy statements. It's usually the last paragraph, and it says, we have the right to update this privacy policy at any time. Please check back here to see what the updates are. And then we found that almost half of the sites don't have version tracking. So even in a world where consumers went back and checked, they have no way to know what the changes are. Like, I would have to download a 10-page privacy statement, check it 6 months later against itself. Like, that's just ridiculous. So what is the point of even having that paragraph?
We don't need that.
Yeah, right. So I think that's a really good example of somewhere where notice of consent, obviously is good, but we need to move far beyond that to move this conversation forward.
I mean, the false premise that all these interactions on the internet operate on some sort of a quasi-contractual basis is so absurd at this point, given the complexity of the issues and the amount of paper that's out there that no one ever reads. Looping back to the point about do not track. I mean, if these were truly sort of these weird one-way contracts, the terms of service and internet privacy policies, then they could be one way in the other direction, and we just create a consumer browser that just pushes out to every web page a set of red lines for all of these terms of service and imposes the consumer terms of service, and then we could just enforce them. And that's how apparently that's how it works in the other direction. So if that were truly the system, then the solution to the privacy regulatory problem would be easy. We would just have the, super duper Mozilla browser or whatever it is that would just push out a, pro-privacy terms of service, and all the companies would have to abide by them, because that's apparently how magic internet contracts work. But unfortunately, that's not going to work out for us, I don't think.
Okay, so as we turn...
Or wait, maybe you could just use Tor.
So as we kind of turn the conversation toward looking at some baselines that we'd like to see, maybe we could just go one by one and say what's the biggest to establish a baseline around.
Well, I will go first because I'm closest to you. Also, that way I don't have to, nobody takes mine. So I think that the number one biggest thing is, do you share my data with anybody else?
Well, you took part of mine. Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think from our perspective, there are lots of ways you can do that. And we think that, sharing, there's always going to be data sharing. We can't go back to a world where that's not going to happen anymore. That's where we are. However, telling users, the types of companies that you're sharing data with is one way. The other way is, we also think that you should tell users why you're using your data. If a user gives their data willingly for some service, and then you turn around and use that same data for a different purpose, that's not okay. And that's something we feel should be really important for companies.
Just building on that second point, because that was where I was going as well, purpose specification. So company needs to collect a piece of data for a specific purpose, whether, weather.com or some weather company, you want to know what the weather is where you are, you tell them where you are. They collect the data for that purpose. They don't use the data for a different purpose. So purpose specification.
Yes, I'm more interested in protection and compensation when it comes to data, and to kind of go a little bit on what you're doing with my data. I'm not sure how I feel about that, or how I feel about the third party. Like, if I use the example that I chopped down trees and I sold you a tree, I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't do with the lumber, like whether you have to build a table or you have to build a chair. I'm also not liable if you build a chair and the chair breaks and somebody falls and gets hurt. So we have to think about where we're going to draw these lines and what is analogous and what's not. I mean, in some instances that may not be the case, but I think if we look at data a little bit more on a property side, that might be helpful in viewing some of these things. It might not, but it's a different way of looking at it.
To be totally contrarian to what Katie just said, I think we need a rights-based approach to privacy that looks at how to protect it, regardless of who you are and, quote unquote, what harm is directly possible to you in the immediate future, which we're never going to know for another decade anyway, and that actually protects the marginalized populations that tend to not be in privacy conversations, which are overwhelmingly white. Since I've just arranged a conference, I've gotten to see that up close and personal, and we need to be looking at where those communities come from, and we need an approach that protects their privacy first.
Yeah, so maybe kind of digging in a little bit on the rights-based approach. I think it's worth going back to what we discussed earlier about the types of data, and I don't think that there is a clear distinction or clear silos of types of data anymore. And the harms associated with an isolated piece of data may not be the same harms as the aggregate data. So I think we need to kind of rethink that framework, not only in how data is used now, but how it will be used in the future, both in different combinations and with new technologies. So, I think it's worth, how should we, let me just throw this to you rather than trying to posit it myself, how should we be thinking about the kind of categorization of data and how we define sensitivity of data in the modern world, and how it may be used in the future, and how can we make sure that people's rights, both individual and collective, human, consumer, whatever you want to call it, are protected.
I'll jump into this one. It's a very complicated issue. I think that there are a number of privacy law frameworks, a number of different privacy law frameworks, both here in the US and internationally, that do distinguish between sensitive and non-sensitive categories of data. So there's historical basis to that, and I think that there is some value in that, because I think that some people believe that the strictest rules, the tightest sort of rights and obligations shouldn't necessarily apply to all types of data. And this goes all the way back to the distinguishing between what is personally identifiable information and what is not personally identifiable information, right? I mean, there's certainly data that on some level people think is not even personal data at all, and maybe that's not even being regulated by, the collection and processing of that type of data is not even within this conversation that we're having. So we have to draw lines somewhere, and I think it does ultimately make sense to distinguish on some bases between sensitive and non-sensitive categories. And one thing I'll add, just kind of like drilling down on that a little bit, is one sensitive category of data that I've focused a lot of my work on over the years that I think we're finally just starting to reckon with the implications of, is location data. I think that for a long time, people were really unaware of the scope of the amount of location data that was out there, that was being collected. I mean, this is not just about an app on your phone that asks you whether or not you want to, use your location at a particular point in time. We just saw the story in the New York Times a few days ago about this magical Google database that sits over in a box somewhere that just has all the sensor data. And guess what? When you have a magic box that has everyone's location data in it, basically the whole world, then yeah, we start talking about entirely different use cases, whether you're law enforcement or whether you're a company or what have you. That data's sitting over there. You're going to start to experiment and think about new ways you can use it. So I think that's an example of a category that I think definitely needs to be in the sensitive category, and historically hasn't always been treated that way. But luckily, we have a Supreme Court decision on Fourth Amendment. We have emerging push for treatment of location data in legislation. So that's just one example of where I would draw a line.
Yeah, I can jump in on that real quick. I agree. And the location data, I think, is fascinating, because I think when you say location data, most people assume it's GPS, right? Or even cell towers. Location data is so much more complicated than that. You can get someone's location in a million different ways. And one thing that we saw in a lot of these statements is that a lot of the statements do say, we don't collect location data, full stop. And then in the next section, they'll say, but we do collect information about your device, including its IP address. And it's like, well, wait, those two things are directly contradictory to each other. And so I think that's a big problem, about how you define what location even means, right?
It's been a thing that I've been contrarian, so I'll pipe in and do that perspective again. I do think we need to determine what's personal and what's anonymized data. And by anonymized, I don't mean a massive amount of data about you that your name has been taken off of. I mean actual anonymized data. If it's personal data, though, this sensitive, non-sensitive distinction, I don't understand how that makes sense anymore. We have algorithmic tools that can make determinations about anybody based on very small amounts of information. When I worked with Alan, which was how many years ago? 5 years ago, they were just saying you can now determine who somebody is, the person's identity, from 2 location points. That's all they needed to backward determine who you were. 5 years of progress, it's easier and faster to determine who somebody is. In the future, knowing somebody's first name and religion, or if they have a dog, can determine any number of things, or at least people will think they can determine any number of things about you. I think if we're trying to, in this technological world, make determinations about what is sensitive and what isn't, we're spending our time doing the wrong thing.
So I would I still stick with non-sensitive and sensitive, but I think there's another category that we haven't talked about. So when I look at non-sensitive, it's public data. It's stuff that I don't mind anyone knowing about me. It's stuff that I freely put out there. Sensitive or private data is data that can cause harm. So that's health information, that's financial information. Someone can steal my identity, somebody can take my money, somebody can take my stuff. But then we brought up aggregation and the connection between the points. And that's where I really think the value is created with data, is if you know where someone is, you know where to follow them, you know where they are on the internet, or you know what they like, or you know when I like to walk my dog, or you know those sorts of things. Like, that's what I would prefer to focus on, is that user controlled, where I can say whether I would like for you to know that about me or I would not. And then there's also, when you think about it, there's Fourth Amendment protected data and there's non-Fourth Amendment protected data. I think a lot of us worked here to get the Email Privacy Act passed, where we wanted warrant for email content, so that police couldn't just say, hey, here's a court order, I want to read all of your emails, which that's a massive invasion of privacy. Not like, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with Google being able to read everything, but that's not going to throw me in jail. But if Google's going to share all that information with law enforcement, that's a huge problem. And, you know, one of the lines where it's really difficult to talk about is, you know, we did not get warrant for email content still, which I'm very frustrated by. I don't see why that is difficult. But when we talk about metadata, you know, that's another thing. Does law enforcement need metadata in order to build a case to get the warrant to read the email content? And that's another discussion. So there are lots of different points. And in talking about location data and whether that requires a warrant or not is really important. I mean, just going up behind somebody and putting a tracker on their car, you shouldn't be able to do privately, and you shouldn't be able to do that as law enforcement. So in looking at, there's lots of different aspects to data and how it becomes sensitive or non-sensitive, or how it should be user-controlled or not user-controlled when we're looking at aggregation, where we're looking at where value is created.
So I think the concept of sensitive data is really interesting, because it's a very personal thing. You know, what's sensitive to me may not be sensitive to you. You know, we know that, for example, depending upon where you live, if I know your zip code and your last name, that may be enough for me to figure out a lot about you. And so in that case, then we have all these theoretical questions. Is that sensitive data, my zip code, my last name? You know, whereas if you live in a highly dense area, you know, and you have a very common last name, that's no longer sensitive information. So I don't know that it's going to be as easy as what they've done with, you know, GDPR or various other legislation to simply say this is what's sensitive. And I think that if we could sit down in a perfect world and say, how do we construct a new internet, a new digital world? You know, how would we do it if we started over? I think we would say that every human being gets to define what they want to share down to a very granular level, and they get to define what they consider sensitive down to each individual piece: IP address versus email versus location versus religious versus, you know, all sorts of other preferences. So I hear the word sensitive, and you know, we're clear about, you know, PII versus non-PII and sensitive PII and how those things are carved out in law, but I don't know that those align with how human beings actually think about sensitive data.
Yeah. At this point, we got about 30 minutes left, so why don't we turn it to the audience to see if we have anybody that has... Can we get the mic over there?
Thanks for all your comments. So I come from the healthcare space, and I imagine what I'd really like to, you know, pick your brains about is this patchwork system. So if I think about just the research aspect of using health data, it's already a patchwork system where you have the common rule and you have FDA regulations and you have HIPAA. And so I'd really love to pick your brain about just the bigger outside of healthcare, and what kind of patchwork are we dealing with, and how do you see all of these different types of privacy regulations that are out there coming together in the future so that we can really truly have privacy?
So I think that every federal approach I've looked at so far doesn't preempt any of the sectoral laws that are out there. The reason for that is twofold. One is that they deal with very specific things that people have historically identified as needing to be dealt with separately. and provide different protections that are unique to those sectors. But I think there's actually a practical approach for why this is, and that's committee jurisdiction. Bringing in a bunch of congressional committees that have jurisdiction over healthcare and the financial sector and all of these other different worlds is going to hugely complicate an approach on privacy, where if you're only dealing with one or two different committees to look at a privacy approach, it's going to be a lot more direct and straightforward. And I think that's just the system of the law that we have created in this country.
I'll just add also that, another area where sort of sub-area of privacy regulation is sort of communications privacy, and that is handled at the federal level by the Federal Communications Commission. And this is another area where historically there's been a bit of a patchwork problem because technology changes and that agency is organized based on technological silos. And so, for example, you have a whole set within the law of privacy rules for cable companies and privacy rules for telecommunications companies, and then those categories start to change. Interestingly, when Congress passed the telecommunications privacy rules in the 1990s, they gave the agency regulatory authority, which actually gives them flexibility in the long run, so they can sort of say, okay, well, it made sense at this point in the 90s for those privacy regulations to apply only to telephone companies, but in the future they can then apply them to also companies that do voice over IP, which sure looks like a telephone company, and then they can expand it further and further if they feel it's needed for consistency. With the cable privacy regulations or rules, they're statutory. They actually don't have the regulatory authority, and so they can't go back under those rules and say, well, these rules that apply to cable companies should also apply to, TV over the internet companies that sure look a lot like cable companies. So there's sort of a historical example for why, in the long term, kind of a more flexible regulatory approach may be useful.
Maybe just to follow up on that, and then we'll take a question. But in terms of looking at, long-term flexibility, how do you go about ensuring that remains flexible and stays up to date with the technological innovations, beyond just saying it's flexible? I mean,
one way not to do it is to rely entirely on Congress because of the Email Privacy Act example that we were talking about. I mean, that is like a consensus position. The government agrees that you have to have a warrant to get email content, and yet we can't get Congress to pass a simple law to say what we all know is already the law is the law. We can't even get that passed. So relying on Congress to come back and update something every couple of years is not going to work. That's why I think that the having a regulatory agency charged with at least keeping track of the changing technology or landscape over time and the definitions of what is regulated and where the kind of whatever lines you're drawing in terms of what's regulated and how. I think that has to be given over to a federal agency over time to make sure that it doesn't get completely out of whack in 10 or 20 years.
Don't preempt the states.
Is the protocol to stand or it doesn't matter? Okay, great. Well, I think it's not rights or compensation. I think it's going to have to be much more complicated than that. But essentially, data is an asset. So the minute an unvalued asset, so nobody really knows what its value is, but it's being taken from people largely without their consent. They couldn't consent to it, not knowing the value anyway. So, I mean, this is a really challenging problem. But one thing I've been curious about in the harms approach, doesn't that require that the person has to make a claim and have it be adjudicated in their favor? And certainly it's going to disadvantage anyone who doesn't have resources to a great extent. And also the way that these assets are being transferred to third parties, people at the bottom of the scale lose an asset that they could otherwise really be benefiting from, and they don't even know that they have it. So I think the harms approach has so many practical problems, and the rights has a lot of benefits, but you need both of those, I think, to make it really be effective. And the sooner we can get to this, the better, in my view.
I think you just named all the harms, right? Those are harms, right? Your stuff is not being protected. So that gives you a spot where you're looking at, we have laws in place to make sure our stuff is protected and that we can be compensated for those things. So that's a right to those items. And we've come to a place where we're realizing that data is worth something. And there are a lot of people who will argue with me that data is not worth anything and blah, blah, blah. I don't believe that's true. I'm never going to believe that's true, especially when the machines are all talking to each other about me. I believe that data has an immense value. But there is no structure to protect that value. There's no structure to protect my currency, which would be why, coming from a libertarian point of view, where I really like to be left alone, but I want everybody else to be left alone too, and I want everyone's stuff to be protected. And right now, I don't think our stuff is protected.
So you raise a lot of interesting, one of the things that I think to add to what you were talking about is enforcement, and that's going to be a really important aspect of this conversation that this panel didn't really talk about, but the previous one did. And David Brody, who oddly enough also used to work with Alan and I, often talks about how having a private right of action favors marginalized communities who traditionally have not been able to rely upon agency and administrative structures to vindicate their rights. And I think when we get to that point in the conversation, which hopefully will be sooner, having that enforcement debate and a real private right of action within the conversation is going to be important.
But a real private right of action would be something that doesn't benefit the trial lawyers so much, right? Like, let's not kid ourselves about who's really benefiting from these class action lawsuits. That, like, if you're having a big group of people who are going into this, like, let's not kid ourselves about who's making the money there. Like, that doesn't work either. And there are a lot of different ways to enforce on this, and there's a lot of different ways to look at case by case how a company is acting. Is this a bad actor? Is this something that we should set? And when our laws catch people doing something wrong, that doesn't mean that the laws aren't working. That means that they worked. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we need more laws. We caught someone doing something wrong, stop doing it. But this idea that a private right of action is beneficial for everyone, I've been part of these, like, class action type lawsuits that I didn't even know I was part of, and what did I get for it? $1.43. That's not really the answer there. I mean, I think when we're looking at enforcement specifically, there should be a nationwide standard. It should be preempted, but that doesn't mean that there's not a role for the states.
I'll chime in to add one thing about the subject the kind of intersection of the subjects you were talking about is that anyone that's sort of engaged and interested in sort of how to think about the current debate over privacy law, baseline privacy legislation, I honestly recommend to everyone that they go back and read Warren and Brandeis, the seminal privacy article, and it seems way out of date because it was published in the late 1800s, but they were facing the same type of dilemma that we're facing today, which is that there's this onslaught of new technology. It has all of these strange implications that they're grappling with, and they defined modern privacy law much in the same context we find ourselves in now, where there's all these new technologies and they have a bunch of different implications, and they're looking forward saying, what are we supposed to think? What are we supposed to do about this? And one thing that they kind of run through in that article is a series of privacy law is not X, privacy law is not Y, looking at existing legal regimes at the time and how privacy law is not quite just an application of this and that. And one of them is actually sort of intellectual property law. And they explain why privacy is not just sort of a new type of property right. And part of the reason is because if you view privacy entirely through a property rights lens, then the goal of the law, the sort of underlying philosophical goal of the law will be to maximize the value of that information, which in the context of data collection means maximizing the collection and use of data, which is actually not the underlying philosophical purpose of privacy law. So that's kind of a bit to your point.
to the question of data sensitivity, how do we think about, or should we even think about, instances where the revelation of my data causes harm to other people, either specific other people or to society as a whole? Some of this was raised but not answered in this morning's sessions. For example, where someone is taking advantage of data about me, let's say, and specific others, to foment divisiveness and voter suppression and so forth and so on.
I think the hardest version of that question gets with in genetic data, because that's an area where other people's participation, even like other people's willing participation in building a system of kind of genetic indexing, actually impacts the privacy of folks that have no participation in the system whatsoever, because we're all related, and that's just how the science end of it works. So I think that that's just one example. You gave another one where, yeah, this is, I think, in the area of, these are the problems that we can't even talk about yet because we haven't solved the easy problems from my perspective. And yeah, it's not, that's another reason why the system can't simply be transactional in the sense of sort of my interaction with one company, one-to-one, what do we agree to? What have they told me? What have I agreed to? Like it's much bigger than that because of the kind of big data elements that Amie was talking about, and AI, and the fact that, you know, data is just increasingly being used in ways that we never would have imagined before. And my data that's collected today may in 5 or 10 years be used in a way that didn't even exist today. So I think it speaks to the need for a much more fundamental legal framework than simply kind of transactional.
I did want to clarify. I do agree with you that it shouldn't just be viewed as a property right. I'm having a hard time finding something else to call it. That's why I keep saying user controlled or something else, because an intellectual property right isn't really what I'm going for here. Like, I don't want a copyright royalty board attached to our data. That would be kind of awful. I think Christine Wilson, FTC commissioner, had a really nice 3 categories. I was just looking on my phone to see if I could find them. But it has some different aspects of different ways to look at data. Does anybody remember what I'll look it up and send it back around, but she had 3 categories. It was kind of more based off of how the data was collected, which I found very interesting. And it was another good way to look at it that kind of took out that what I've been trying to get away from is calling it a property right, but I'm not really sure how to define what it is that we're looking at. Because I think that's a lot of what we're working on, is how do we define this?
Okay, let's take one more question and then bring it back to the panel to kind of round things out.
Okay, so my question is, we've seen last year a number of bills introduced, and this year they're starting to be introduced, and also comprehensive bills are being worked on, and we have silo bills. So my question for the panelists is, if it was up to you alone to pick a bill, what would be your ideal bill? What would it contain, and why?
I will call your attention back to my one piece of paper. I don't think we've seen the vehicle that's going to get the bill that's going to get the most attention yet. There's a committee that is being reported on out of the Senate that we haven't seen the results of that committee yet. I imagine that's going to eat up a lot of the energy in the room. Some of the approaches we have seen, I think, are either incomplete or bad outright. In a lot of ways, there are a couple bills that just ingrain the current system, tell people something, and let them click a box. And I don't think that gives us anything new. We have, and I'm happy to share it with anybody, I think I have 3 copies here, where we've measured some of the bills that have been either published or introduced. And we're going to continue to look at the new ones as they come out to see how good they are. And we need to be looking at it in that kind of objective realm. And again, journalists tend to report on this as if something's not coming, we're not going to get it, and people don't take privacy seriously. And I would love to stay away from that narrative because we are getting these bills passed at the state level and they're interesting and good and taking these different approaches. So if we don't see a privacy bill passed in the next 2 months, that's not the end of the conversation. And the news outlets will tell you it is. But this is a much longer, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we're going to have to make sure we get it right rather than get it fast.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Amie has said, and also note that our policy team at Epic has also signed on to a few statements regarding kind of ideal elements of a bill, and is also starting to look at the new bills and how they measure up. Just to give sort of my own personal reason, I was teaching this last week in the privacy class that I co-teach in, looking at a couple of recent bills and comparing them, and it's just from a pure like do's and don'ts standpoint, some interesting things that come up. One is just to write a bill that's completely kicks everything down the road to a regulatory agency. That's the Rubio bill, and basically just says, oh, the FTC will just figure this all out for us. That's not a good outcome. Especially when you're not specific about what it is you want. And then another sort of approach that I think is a modified maybe version of notice and choice that's incredibly problematic is what happened in the Klobuchar bill, which is sort of like a bill that just wants us to all to get 1 million prompts every time we sign up for an account. Basically says that every kind of data collection choice should be forced upon us when we sign up for a new account, which is an extreme version of the problem people sometimes describe as consent fatigue, right? I mean, people get annoyed by the fact that you have that little cookie pop up at the bottom of the web page now because some enterprising attorney decided that was GDPR compliance, that little accept button. But imagine that times like 1,000 every time you sign up for an account, and you can imagine people's eyes will glaze over very quickly. So those are not the solutions. Some of the things that would make the list are Federal Data Protection Agency, baseline standard, not a ceiling, no preemption of state standards, those sorts of things.
I haven't seen anything yet that I like. I mean, and I would say I do want preemption. I want it to be a national standard. We're talking about the internet. You know, it cuts across borders. We can't have California deciding what the internet's going to look like for everybody. That's not the way the country was designed. And I think we have a lot to benefit from competition among the states, and seeing what the states are pushing out is interesting, and it's definitely something that spurs the federal government forward. But I would agree that I don't want to see something fast. I want to see something right, or as close to that as whatever it could be. And I don't think it's, this whole idea that, yeah, it's over if they don't do something right now. No way. I mean, a lot of us here have been working on this for how long? And they just started working on, right? They just started working on a bill. Like, I don't want, maybe a year or so, it feels like? Yeah. Like, seriously looking at it for a year. No, that's not going to be the thing that is right. And it's not going to be the thing, but it is going to be a starting point, and we do have a conversation now, and I am very excited that other people care about this as much as we do now. But yeah, preemption is a good thing.
Okay, so I want to give everybody a chance to round out this panel. I want to drop the first word, given all these complexities, the first word of the title of this panel, which is, how can we reach data privacy in the US? And say, can we reach data privacy in the US? Because it strikes me that we have groups that are very opposed, kind of in their own corners. Thankfully, we're coming together at events like this and elsewhere, but can we reach data privacy? And if so, what's the one thing that you'd like to end this panel with? A call to action, maybe.
I'll jump in here. I'm optimistic. I do think that there's an opportunity for us to do something that will be impactful and affect generations in the future. What that looks like, I don't know. I think there are a lot of disagreements about how that should be implemented, and like you mentioned, who should be in charge of it. If there's one thing that I could leave the audience with, it's this. It's that data is a lot like a sneeze, right? Once it leaves, there's no getting it back in. And so while there's not a fire we have to put out right now, the longer that this takes, the more that the companies are collecting very large amounts of data about us. And we don't yet know what that will look like in a decade when they have that information. So sooner would be much better than later.
Yeah, I have to agree. I'm also optimistic. From the internet side's perspective, we're an organization that really relies a lot on multi-stakeholder processes where you bring everybody you can think of who has something to do with whatever the issue is into a room and figure it out. And something that what makes me optimistic is that until very recently, and no offense to the lawyers on the panel, they're the only people involved until, a couple of years ago. But now that you see civil society groups, you see, minority communities, you see lots of other people realizing that this is a problem. And I think that'll make the whatever happens, much stronger. Privacy is no longer the sort of realm of regulation. It's a societal problem.
I would, my answer and big picture takeaway is yes, we can do better. There was a reaction maybe after the GDPR initially passed that where some folks in the US were saying, oh, this is a very European thing, this is weird, we don't like this. No, we've moved past that. We realize that we do need federal privacy legislation in the United States, and we can do better. So if we're worried about, competing with Europe on something, let's beat them. Let's have an even better privacy law than they have. So yes, we can do better.
Yes, we can do better, but I would rather not compete on who has the best or the most regulation, which I think is what Europe tries to do since they don't have the most companies. And I think, can we do better? Of course, but we need to talk about what is privacy. And I think that's a lot of what we've tried to do here is there are a lot of different viewpoints as to what privacy is and how different data affects different people. And I would like to see something that spans all industries and covers all of these different interests. But in order to do that, I feel like data has to be broken down into different categories as best as we can. And I know that's not perfect because when we look at if it's technology based, that doesn't really work when we just do it based off the technology. But we do the best that we can at the time. I would like to see us do better, but really I think something that would help us a lot is focusing more on security.
I don't know where, and I don't know when, but it will absolutely happen. I will go on the record with that. I'm not jinxing the entire thing. And if I had something to leave, the US actually led this conversation. The US is where the whole data privacy conversation began. And then we were like, and now everybody else should go off and do things with this. And we gave it up. And it's coming back. And if we don't do something, Europe's done something, Brazil's done something, we're gonna have the whole world where everybody has privacy rights but Americans, and that's just really sad considering we're where this gave birth to a lot of this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you. You're all much more concise than I expected in terms of wrapping up. So we actually have a little extra time if anybody has any other thoughts or one more question from the audience. I saw your hand up earlier, so.
This question is for the moderator. No, just kidding. Whoever wants to answer it. So we have, in the US, traditionally, if markets don't work well, there's regulation, but there's also trying to make the markets work better. There's antitrust. And so I'm expecting support from both Katie and Kevin for this idea. Katie, because then the markets will work better. Kevin, because he mentioned Brandeis earlier. And this is not my idea, this comes out of Yale Law School, this idea that we should start regarding large accumulations of data as a reason to engage in some antitrust action. If you have too much of the data in a particular market, then you can't acquire anybody else. Or perhaps if you give the data on to other companies, that's an abuse of a dominant position. And so I haven't heard antitrust mentioned. I've heard this idea of rights and property, but what about a structural remedy?
I think that you're absolutely right that it's something that it's not necessarily part of the comprehensive privacy legislation conversation, but it is part of the broader conversation, that specific conversation. But I think this issue of data and competition has to be part of the conversation about competition law in the United States. And there's been calls for that for over a decade, and I think we're well sort of behind the ball on that. We need to catch up. But I mean, it is essential. There are companies out there whose entire value base is the data that they hold. So how can that not be? If you're going to have a competition analysis at all, and if you're not analyzing the data, then you're actually missing the point. So I think it has to be part of it.
So, where I look at the market failure is that there is no harm from the data being taken. So if I'm going to say that there is a market, if I were to say that there is a market failure, then first we would have to recognize data for the value that it has, and that data being taken away from me without me being compensated is a harm. Right now, that's not a harm. So, and I also, large amounts of market share, large amounts of money, that's not anti-competitive, right? Just because you're good at your job, just because you're a good company and people like you, doesn't mean that it's anti-competitive. What's anti-competitive is preventing other people from getting in the market and using that share to prevent other people from getting in the market. Now, I can't say whether we are doing that with or without data, because that doesn't fall into antitrust right now. So it's hard to know. And it's hard to know whether people are being prevented or not. If you're looking at flows of competition, which is why I stick more with harm and less with talking specifically about anti-competitive practices, because when you look at harm to individuals or harm to companies, I think it's a little bit clearer under the legal structure that we have right now.
Oh, looks like do we have time? Sure.
Okay. Hi. Thank you very much. It's very quick anyway. So there's been a lot of discussion about data as property and having value, and of course that's a really interesting question, and how we ensure that users get the value of the data. But one thing that is raised by that is there have been an awful lot of problems with these companies who are nefarious actors, who are abusing data and so forth, are actually using this as a way to incentivize people to give their data, especially in places like the Global South. So, this is being coached in terms of inclusivity in, online and so on, and the ways in which data is being used and abused by companies that are harvesting is really, really problematic, and it affects, of course, the weakest in society and in the world. I was going to suggest that, maybe you could respond to that, and also talk about how you could maybe incorporate sort of social benefits for society rather than material benefits for individuals. Thanks.
I think that's 100% right. And we're seeing that play out. As I said, my organization is international. We have an office in Argentina and an office in Costa Rica, and we see this happen all the time. And it's one of the reasons that we work on this issue as an organization who also focuses on users at risk. I will say the one area where I think we need more research into valuation is into how to value non-financial data in terms of putting it in a frame that companies can understand and better protect. Right now, at least in the US, Europe is different. Most of the data breach notification is tied to financial information, which means there's not a lot of work that goes into how do we protect all of this other information that we don't have to notify people about when it breaches. And doing some more research, we actually specifically call out the need to do a lot more research around that so it can go into this risk analysis framework and provide a better grounding for how we approach that information. And so I can see value there, but I think the societal risk is something that we need to be looking at. It kind of has come up in a few different threads throughout the conversation. And if we're only looking at it as a value, then we're going to leave that behind.
So and again, I want to clarify a little bit that it's hard. I don't have the right word yet. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but somewhere around property, somewhere around this, I don't know. But I do, when we do talk about property rights, I do believe that property rights benefit the least among us and benefit most economies in most countries. I mean, if you look back to Shining Path, what got them out of Peru was people getting property rights. One of the things that leads to insurgents communities in other countries is they're providing and protecting property rights for people who have not been protected, who are having their things taken from them. So if we're able to protect people's things, then they have more rights and they have more values, and that does protect the least among us. That doesn't necessarily mean that people who already have stuff get more stuff. That means people whose stuff hasn't been recognized as theirs is now recognized.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you all for a lively discussion. I'm really looking forward to this next panel that we'll have, but first we'll have a 15-minute coffee break.